I've got to say, I really prefer the Sega Mega Drive to the Sega Genesis. Why? What's in a name? Well, there's already two other things called Genesis, and not that I have anything against either of them, but I don't want to be reminded of Phil Collins and all the other biblical patriarchs when I'm gaming. The trouble is though, well, the Mega Drive, it's got a better name, but it's either Japanese with some region locking issues or it's European PAL, like this console that I have here, and PAL consoles have problems. But I'm going to solve them, and I'm going to make this here Mega Drive run games better than it ever did before with some mods. To start with, I've got a switchless region mod kit, which, well, does what it sounds like it should do, hopefully. I've also got an RGB bypass kit here, which, well, I was going to install, but I didn't for reasons that I'll go into later. But best of all, the most exciting part of this, the ingredients to overclock the system and make the CPU run faster for improved gaming performance. Is it a good idea to overclock the Mega Drive? Well, let's find out. But before I go any further, a word from today's sponsor, ExpressVPN. If you're the sort of savvy person who watches this channel, you probably already know what a VPN is. You've probably even heard of ExpressVPN. They are a trusted brand. You probably know how they can hide your IP address from sinister third parties and let you change your online location, allowing you to unlock content from all around the world. Yeah, VPNs are great, but why ExpressVPN? Well, they are rated #1 by TechRadar and CNET, amongst others. They have 24/7 customer support, they are consistently faster than any other VPN provider, and it's really easy to set up too. I hate messing around with network stuff, but this is all zero hassle. Yes, ExpressVPN is your all-in-one VPN provider. Click the link in the description for 3 months absolutely free. I personally, most of all, use this for getting around region-locked content. That by itself is worth the price of admission, plus all the other good stuff. Give it a go, click the link below and help support this channel. And now, on with the show. So let's start out with the region mod, and well, I've already done the quick and dirty version of this in my last video. For that, I just cut a trace on the motherboard to permanently put it in USA mode. That worked fine, but this kit will allow me to switch back and forth between all 3 regions, Japan, the USA and Europe, very easily with just the reset button, so why not? Let's get going by disassembling the console, not too hard once you've removed the screws. The only tricky part turned out to be the power LED. Yeah, I thought it would unclip somehow, but it just broke off. Oh well, no matter, I'm going to be installing a replacement LED as part of this mod anyway. Next, I need to cut a couple more traces on the board. Firstly, I need to make sure that all the region mode jumpers are cut through. And then I need to cut the reset line. That may sound a bit drastic, so let me explain how this mod works. On the Mega Drive or Genesis, there are a set of jumpers inside that determine the language setting of the system, English or Japanese, and the video output, 50Hz PAL or 60Hz NTSC. These are hardwired in the factory usually, but this mod kit bridges those connections and switches between them on the fly with the reset button. So a couple of other things I need to do now to prepare the board to make those connections. Uncovering a bit of the trace here to allow a connection to the reset line, and also cleaning up the solder pads for the jumpers. Not all Mega Drives are so conveniently laid out, but this Model 1 is very easy to work on. Next, I need to connect all the wires from the correct points on the motherboard to the mod board itself, and also deal with the replacement LED, which signifies what region is currently active. And with all the connections done, time to enshroud the kit board in some heat shrink. Maybe overkill, but this should stop it shorting anything on the board, no matter where I put it. Then tidy up the wires with some teeny tiny cable ties I happen to have. Stick the board down with some double-sided tape type sticky stuff. And finally secure everything else down with a bit of insulation tape. That looks pretty good, let's test it out. The red light means we're in USA mode. And hold down the reset button and yep, green light means we're in PAL mode, so it's doing just what it should. Let's carry on with the overclock mod now, which involves something a bit more troublesome, this CPU. And this is not a kit, it's not that complicated, just a 10 MHz 4-pin oscillator, a piece of strip board and 2 switches. All readily available off-the-shelf stuff and maybe some wire too, but that's it. Let's start putting it together, soldering the oscillator to the board to start with. Yeah, I scored down the middle of the strip board to separate the traces too. Then solder on the connecting wires. Then let's enshroud the whole thing in heat shrink again, why not? At this point it might be a good idea to explain how this mod works, and it really is ridiculously simple. The stock Mega Drive CPU runs at about 7.6 MHz, a speed which is set by an electronic oscillator on the motherboard connected to pin 15 of the CPU. We're going to interrupt this connection by lifting that pin and installing a switch. Switch it one way and the original connection to the oscillator on the board is made, but switch it the other and we make a connection to a new 10 MHz oscillator. Apparently that's all it takes to overclock the Mega Drive, just bodging in another oscillator. It seems too simple to be true, but let's find out. Also, I'm going to be installing a halt switch too. This is much simpler, it just makes a connection to ground or earth on pin 17, which stops the processor completely and allows you to change oscillators whilst the game is still running, but I will demonstrate that later. Okay, now it's time for the slightly fraught process of desoldering and lifting up that pin 15. If it breaks, well that's bad news, you'll probably need a new CPU, but I did manage to avoid that. And it's just a matter of wiring everything up to the 2 switches. So that's all wired up, let's give it a test with Super Hang-On. Have I done this right? And well, yeah, it does seem to be working, at least in the original 7.6 MHz mode. And yeah, I know it's in the wrong aspect ratio, but that doesn't matter. Let's give the overclock a try. And it works. I immediately fell off, but it works. Let's start a new game and well, I'll go to the foot of our stairs. I'm amazed. Yeah, it's not a huge difference, but the game is now running more smoothly in 10 MHz mode. Maybe not so obvious to look at, but it definitely feels faster and more responsive to play. Let's finish off by drilling some holes into the case to fit the switches into, probably using the wrong drill bit, the wrong technique, but I managed to make 2 holes without dying, so that's good. And then fit the switches into said holes. Then it's time to stick the oscillator down with some more gunge and generally just tidy everything up with some more tape and tiny cable ties. And this is the end result. I think that looks okay actually, and I should be able to assemble everything without getting the wires caught. Yeah, pretty neat by my standards. I'm gonna call that one done. One last thing, I've got to deal with the old LED, which is still permanently fixed into the case. I need to get rid of that to install the replacement one. I just went at it with a cut-off wheel on my inexpensive rotary tool that did the job, and now everything can be reassembled into the end result. I did forget to film myself reassembling everything and putting the LED in, but I just stuck it in with some tape. You're not really missing anything particularly interesting. So that's it, mods finished for now. Let's demonstrate what this thing can do. You've already seen the region switch, but here it is again in the fully assembled console, going from Euro PAL with a green light to Japanese NTSC with the orange light. Yeah, that works fine. But now I'll show you what's going on with these switches on the back and how you change modes. First of all, just flicking the overclock switch causes the system to immediately crash with an error message. Yeah, we can reset and everything is fine, or even avoid the issue entirely by just switching it whilst the system isn't on. But to switch on the fly, we can use the halt switch, which pauses the main CPU. Then we can change the overclock switch. And finally on halt and everything runs without crashing. Is this an absolutely necessary feature? Well, no, you could probably live without it, but it can make things easier. If you've got an EverDrive, loading a game in overclock mode can cause problems. It's best to leave it off until the game is actually running. But let us also marvel at the picture quality I've got here. Okay, it's not that easy to see with me just filming the TV screen, but trust me, it really does look great in person. Originally, I did have some problems that I wanted to correct, the big one being that a lot of the time the picture would flicker on and off, especially when I first powered the system up, but at random times too. I was going to install the RGB mod, the bypass kit, in the hope that it would fix this issue, but reading through the instructions for the mod, I found this. For this mod to work, you need a cable wired for composite sync, not composite video sync, confusingly named, but a minor difference in the way your cable is wired. Well, my cable was not wired that way, so I did a quick bodge to make it compatible before I went on with the mod. When I tried it out, I found the picture already looked pretty amazing with just the rewired cable. The flickering problem solved, no interference, about the best picture I've ever seen out of a retro console. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I didn't. Without getting too sidetracked in this, the cable wired for composite sync worked so well that I really didn't see the need to do anything other than get a new cable. You can easily buy cables that are already wired in this way, so if you're having the same trouble as me, try that. Anyway, back to the overclocking. Just what exactly can it do on the Mega Drive or the Genesis? The same mod will work on both consoles. Well, in short, it's going to make games run a bit better. Yes, you're looking at Sonic 2 running in overclock mode, and yes, it does have less slowdown, but the effect on this game is not immediately obvious, so let's have a look at something that maybe shows the faster processor a bit better. Here we have race driving running at the stock speed, a conversion of the massively powerful Atari arcade machine original. It isn't bad for a home conversion of this game, but it is choppy. Now let's see it in overclock mode. And yet, starting the same race, it is smoother, it is faster, it does have a higher frame rate. I mean, not massively, I will admit, but it does improve things and make the game more enjoyable. I could say the same thing about Steel Talons, another 3D Atari arcade conversion. The non-overclocked version is, well, it takes its time getting those frames on the screen. With the overclock on, again, it's quite a bit better. Still not jaw-dropping, but it does take the game into a much more playable territory. I've got to admit, I was hoping for some kind of money shot in this, trying out different games, maybe finding one that really showed a marked difference. In every case, for every game that I tried, the difference is pretty subtle. You can go for faster overclocks, but on the real hardware, what you can do is limited. With many games like NBA Jam here, you're not going to see huge changes. Most of the time, upping the processor speed is just going to make the game run a bit more smoothly with less slowdown when things get busy. It's not going to massively alter the experience, but perhaps that's not such a bad thing. But now you may be asking, how can this work at all? This is not like modern systems. The Mega Drive can't have been designed with this in mind. None of these games were made to be overclocked. Why doesn't speeding up the processor just break everything? Well, on some classic systems, overclocking doesn't work at all, but on the Mega Drive, the way that it's built does mean that it can be done. An important thing is the fact that its CPU is a standalone off-the-shelf component, separate from the video chip and the sound system, meaning that it can be sped up without affecting anything else. How does this help? Well, let's take the example of the classic racing game F1 from Domark to see what's happening. This is another that definitely benefits from overclocking, but let's look at this in an emulator though so we can better see what's happening. Now, no matter what on a classic console like the Mega Drive, the video chip always outputs graphics at the same frame rate to the TV. 50 frames per second PAL and 60 frames per second NTSC. Anything else and the TVs couldn't handle it. But just because the output is locked to 60 frames per second, it doesn't mean that each frame has to be different. If I slow the game right down and add a frame counter in the top left, you can see what I mean. The frame counter constantly counts up, but the image is only updated about every 5 frames. Not everything happens on the same frame, but it's about this rate. The rest of the time it's just repeating the same thing over again, giving an effective frame rate of 60 divided into 5 or 12 frames per second. It takes 5 frames worth of time for 1 frame to be drawn, limiting the final frame rate. And yes, there's nothing happening on the screen in between updates, but behind the scenes the CPU is constructing the next frame into a buffer, ready to be shown when it's completed. By increasing the clock speed of the CPU, we make it work faster, so it can draw frames faster. With the overclock on, the CPU now only takes 3 or 4 frames worth of time to draw a new update, effectively increasing the frame rate to 15 or 20 frames per second. A small but welcome improvement, and interestingly, it doesn't speed up the whole game, it just makes it smoother. In overclock mode, the seconds counter still goes by at the same rate. It must be tied to the video chip and not the CPU. I should also point out that the frame values that I've given are approximate. The actual frame rate changes throughout the game depending on what's happening, but in general, overclocking means a higher frame rate. But anyway, on games that usually run at the full 50 or 60 frames per second already, like Contra Hardcore, the overclock isn't going to make any difference most of the time. Speeding up the CPU here won't make the game run faster, and it won't make more frames per second either. But if there are hectic parts when things do slow down, an overclock system will make the game run better, which has got to be a good thing. And yes, there really should be more games where you can play as an anthropomorphic dog with a gun for an arm, but well, Konami aren't what they used to be. So is overclocking the Mega Drive or the Genesis a good idea? Well, I would say unequivocally, yes it is. I'm amazed at how well it worked. I really thought it would be much more finicky, but it worked right away the first time and was just totally straightforward. And I didn't find any game that wouldn't work with it switched on, even if it didn't make much difference. Nothing crashed or had anything other than some very minor graphical glitches. I can't say it's going to be the same with every model of this console, but it really was not that hard to install compared to a lot of other mods anyway. And it's dirt cheap too. The components to do this cost me just under £8 or $10 all off eBay. If you've got the moderate soldering skill required, lifting that CPU pin being the hard part, if you think you can handle that, give it a go. Is there a downside to this? Will it make it overheat or shorten the life of the CPU? Well, from what I've heard, not really. I certainly didn't have any issues running it for a while, but if it does burn down my house, I will let you know. And yes, the switchless region mod too, that works really well also, and it was, well, not quite so cheap, but hardly massively expensive. There's quite a few kits available on the market. I'll put a link below to the one that I bought, but if you're outside of the UK, you may be able to find it cheaper locally. Some kits do have the replacement LED on its own little board separately, so they might be easier to install, but well, what I got worked fine. So that's a successful console modding session. I think time now to say goodbye. Thank you as always to my ever generous Patreons. I always say this at the end of every video, but your help really does make a big difference, and if anyone else would like to join them, there is a link below. Also, if you haven't already and you're still watching, well, please do subscribe. It helps my channel out and means you're more likely to see my videos in the future. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.